My name is Erasmus Sefia, and I'll be your host for today. Today's episode is a bit different. We just don't want to be reacting to all of the headlines. We want to slow down a bit, pull back the car, and look at the architecture behind the global economy. Because right now, something profound is indeed happening. The US is raising tariffs on everything from electric vehicles to semiconductors to manufacturing goods all over the world. China, which is one of the biggest trade partners or trade countries, is also recalibrating, and we're seeing the global supply chains being redrawn. The old rules that governed trade, debt, and the development for decades are being questioned, and in some cases being written entirely. And somewhere in the midst of all of this is Africa. Too often, we're being treated as a bystander in these shifts. But what if this is a moment of opportunity? Is this actually Africa's opening? Today, we're going deep on global trade, not just about who exports what, but who sets the terms, who builds the rules and the digital infrastructure, who decides how debt is restructured, and who gets access to critical minerals, credits, and climate finance. And at the heart of it all, there's a much bigger question. Can Africa move from the margins of the global economy to the center? And to discuss all of this with me, I have a very brilliant personality over here. I'm going to allow for him to also introduce himself, but just a bit about him. Shafic Osman is a lawyer from Ghana, currently pursuing graduate studies in international law at the London School of Economics and Political Science. His research is on the claims to justice emerging from the global debt architecture, so I believe that he's the right man to have this conversation with. In addition, and I hate to read this part, but I need to do that. In addition to that, he's an unrepentant fan of Manchester United, of whom we've been discussing a lot on this episode, and he's also a chronic online chatterbox. Thank you so much, Shafiq, and welcome to the Shaft episode.
Hi, thanks a lot, Erasmus. Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me once again. We've known each other from debates.
Yes.
Had our own tensions in the past. Exactly, yeah. Ken USC UG debates, obviously. I'll be very quick to just give all the glory to Ken USC. You guys really beat us for a very long time. So you guys get to keep all the glories for that. Yeah, but
I have to send it to the boys. I have to.
Oh yeah. As for this part, I've already considered a very long time ago. Yeah, but very happy to be on here. I've also been following the episodes, been a very big fan of it. I think these conversations need to be happening, and seeing debaters being the ones platforming other debaters and other speakers to have the necessary conversations, and also just recognizing that there's a space that is forgotten or is ignored, and just getting the right people to speak about it is a huge thing. Yeah, so I'm glad I'm finally on. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. No, and it's incredible. I just want to start with, because I do know that you are reading international law at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and I think it's quite fascinating that in the midst of all of these things happening, you are an African, or you are someone who belongs to the soil, and you find yourself in the West, which means that you sort of have a double lens in the way in which you view all of this. I'm just a bit curious in terms of your studies. What has been the kind of conversation that is being had around this topic? Is there a level of excitement in there? What's happening within academia in terms of people's reaction to this?
Right, yeah, sure. So let me just take a few steps back. So when I was doing my master's, when I was going to do my master's, I always knew I wanted to study the global economy. So I had my prior experience. So my background has been in economics, and then I did the postgrad law at Legon before coming to do my master's here. So for my master's, I was studying international economic law, and just before we had to choose our topics for our dissertation, Ghana defaulted on its loans in December 2022, and it's so interesting the conversations we're having in class about the default and what that meant and all of that kind of stuff, right? So that was my first interaction with questions of debt from a law perspective, or questions of sovereign debts, like when countries are borrowing and like lending from a law perspective. Usually when you hear about it, it's mainly from like purely economics, Ministry of Finance, that kind of stuff. But then I recognized that there were legal questions that I had to be engaged with. So for me, it felt like, okay, this is an area that has largely been neglected. There was a period in our history where people had written about it, and maybe later in the conversation we can talk about that intellectual history and how maybe we've kind of lost this along the line. So there was a period where people were engaging with it, but then I recognized that from HIPIC, Structural Adjustment Program, all of those times, nobody was engaging with it from like the law perspective. So I was like, okay, maybe this is a space for me to enter. So I wrote my master's on that, and the more I was writing, the more I was researching, the more I realized that, okay, it is more than just the country defaulting on its loan. It's also a very big question of okay, what is the architecture itself? What does it look like? What are the claims that the architecture makes? And what claims can countries make on that architecture? So you recognize or you realize that academia is very rife with questions of the global debt architecture being it's not fit for purpose. So right now, that's like the biggest question, and a lot of the conversations at the tail end of it. Okay, so debt restructuring. So when a company takes out a loan and is not able to pay out, there are insolvency processes that are provided by law, by statute, that allows for easy restructuring processes. But for countries, there's no multilateral law that allows for that. It's very much on a creditor-debtor basis. So you end up the interactions are very, very limited. So are very discrete. So you interact with one person or one set of creditors, go and interact with another set of creditors and that kind of stuff. So it has its own problem. So academia currently is basically there's a consensus that the architecture is not fit for purpose. But then there's also a part of the conversation that architecture is not engaging with, and at least that's what I think my research is trying to do, which is to see, okay, can we take a step back from the restructuring part of it? Can we go all the way back up, all the way to the point where, all the way to asking the question of, okay, why do countries even borrow in the first place? Right? Why are African countries or global South countries at a place where they keep on having to borrow to be able to finance their development? So that's the part of the conversation that I'm trying to insert myself in. Yeah. So just ask
yeah, that's a brilliant appetizer. That's a really, really brilliant appetizer, and I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to start going into some of the historical context with this, with the Bretton Woods institutions, and then talk about how Africa came into play. And I think this will be very, very key, especially when we start talking about the New World Order. But just to place set, or just to level set the conversation, I think what brought us here in the first place is the global tariffs, which we've seen by the man himself, who is Trump. We woke up one day and this man decided to hit each and every one with tariffs. We saw outrageous levels of tariffs. I think over 130% hit on China, which is, like I said, one of the biggest trading partners of most countries within the world. And when we sought to understand why this was happening, it wasn't just a matter of trying to put in a tariff to create a protectionist economy, but there seems to be some form of a grand plan to be able to restructure what global trade in itself should look like. So I was wondering if this is something that you can talk to us a bit more about in terms of what these tariffs in themselves are meant to do and how it is affecting global trade as it is.
Right. Yeah, definitely. So, and I love that we start from the question of debt and we now segue into question of tariffs, and it's broadly all falls under the question of global economic governance, right? So for me, my reading of the situation is that America is worried of what China represents on the international front, right? And so you've always heard about. We've always heard from American leaders about the question of China and how to engage with China. And I think the recognition on their part is just recognizing that over the last 20 to 25 years, this silent beast, in quotes, has just woken up and is just running roughshod around the world, right? So in as much as it is not trying to assert itself geopolitically in the way that the West has done in the past, where it's okay, we have these sets of values, we want to export them and that kind of stuff, it is still being able to it's still getting its influence in the right way, right? It's still largely very transactional in the way it goes about doing its stuff, and still being able to like make the inroads at the right places. So in the last American administration, the previous one, you were hearing questions of overproduction. I mean, people like the American leaders, the Trade Secretary Janet Yellen kept on talking about how the Chinese were overproducing. Like you never hear that being a problem, right? Usually, like when a country's overproducing, the question, right? Yeah, exactly.
More goods,
exactly. Yeah, more goods, like export it to other places that like people need and all that kind of stuff, right? Like for instance, like questions of the components of like the renewable transition that we need, like solar panels and stuff like that. Like people were having problems with China overproducing it. But like the question, I mean, the response to that would have been, this is a great thing, right? If you're crazy about this green transition and you want countries to move from fossil fuels to cleaner energies, you should be happy that there's this country that's like overproducing these things and they can like export it to other parts of the world. So that's just by way of context, right? So I think that's what's happening. Like I think America just wants a response to China, but the Trump administration just also, maybe that is the way he shows tact or the way he shows strategy, decides to just like rope everyone into it and decides to like make America the victim in this situation. And so to him, every country that America has a trade deficit with, it's a country that's treating America unfairly. But then there's a fundamental problem with that assumption, because so like the example of Lesotho, for instance, right? Like so to him, because they have a trade deficit with Lesotho, then Lesotho is cheating them. But you forget that like the reason why you have that is that like you're buying every diamond or every natural resource that is produced by Lesotho. It's a very, very small country, right? And it's not Lesotho's not a rich country, so they're not going to be able to like import your stuff exactly a lot from you, and especially when your dollar is way stronger than theirs. So this is what's happening. But then I think, like so many people have said, the bigger target is China at the end of the day. It becomes very necessary for him to let it look like it's methodical. And we also the formula like that they put out, and how like so many people were making fun of it and say like it was just like Chat GPT formula or whatever it is. Like very, very basic level of thinking went into that stuff. So that's what, like, that's just like setting the ground and like talking about that. So for me, I think what Trump is doing is my reading of Trump is that I don't think he's doing anything that is specifically like different from what America has always been doing like in the past. I think the only thing he's doing is that like he is sleeping on America's like soft power, right? And he's willing to like throw it away in exchange for being just purely transactional. So while in the past, like America will use things like VOA, Voice of America, to spread its version of like democracy around the world, he thinks that's no longer necessary, right? He thinks, okay, this is a budget line that he needs to cut off. And if you have people who are not politicians, who are not political scientists, who understand the value of like soft power, handling your expenses, people like Elon Musk, they're going to think, okay, this is like a budget line for us to like cancel out. So that's where I think he might be
numbers, right? Not
right. And so like for me, I think like that is where like that's where like they are coming from, and that's where they might be getting it wrong when it comes to like trading away the soft power that they have. But I think on the larger scheme of it, it is still very much a hegemonic like project for America, right? It's still very much that idea of like America first, because like both Biden and all of those guys, they've always been America first, right? Like let's not kid ourselves. Like they are always going to be America first. Like I think at the end of the day, it always circles back to that question. It's just a question of like, okay, how do we get to that America first point? And that's where like Trump crudely goes about like putting all the cards in front of everyone and just telling everyone that like, oh, see, in the past we were using U.S. State departments to promote all these values. When like with Biden or Obama or Bush, they were not doing that, right? So I guess like that's my thing, right? But at least we've seen that there's some level of like cool heads are prevailing at the moment, and it also was I think also very much was a thing of Trump just trying to have everyone come and kiss the ring on the finger, right? And so you see immediately like all of these things were happening. Starmer quickly rushed to the US. We saw Macron doing that. We saw David Carney doing that.
Yes.
I just heard Ramaphosa is going to do that, and we know what he's been trying to do with the South Africans, right? Yeah. So clearly, it's very much a thing for him where it's like, okay, come in, like kiss the ring on the finger. But with the Arabs, he's with the Gulf. He's currently in the Gulf countries, which maybe is a different like strategy for him. Which I guess in that instance, he realizes he can actually like extract way more from them, and they're willing. They clearly are very willing to extract way to give more to the Americans, because also again they recognize the geopolitics of time and the need to like push for more stability in the region than anything else.
Yeah, I think 600 over 600 billion worth of investment
and
from
it's insane. I think there was another. I can't remember whether it was like Qatar or so, like 1 point something trillion dollars in like it's yeah. I mean he's very transactional to a fault. He's given people like, I mean he's given us like reason to pause and question how politics is supposed to be done, international relations is supposed to be done, and yeah, it will be very interesting to see how America reassets itself on the international front.
I think
push Trump hold.
Yeah, I think the perspective you give over here is very interesting, because like all along, most of the outrage that we've seen with this is pointed towards saying, oh well, this is not how America should behave, this is not how America should treat its allies, that and there's sort of like a reflection of what America's core values are and things like that. But not too long ago, we were all calling America for the sham that it was. I think it is quite crazy for me to hear now that people think these are the values that should be at the forefront of what they are doing. It's quite clear that this is a country that has been willing to sidestep the rules every time it favors them. And it just seems that Trump's personality, which is a bit more brazen.
Yeah, it's like let me give you another example. Right? So look at the World Trade Organization, which is the body that's in charge of like setting out the rules for trade and all of that kind of stuff. So America for the longest time, for a while, has felt like they were not getting like the decisions of the highest decision making body, the appellate body, was not going its way. And so when it got to time for the members of the appellate body to be nominated, America frustrated the process. And again, it started doing that under Obama. But the good thing, at least at that time, was that like, so the way the membership of the body is that I think it's so they retire, but like they don't all retire at the same time. It's not a tenured position. So when it got to time when the Obama administration did not take part in the renewal process of some of the judges on the appellate body, it continued into Trump 1, and also again continued into Biden 1. So at the moment we have an appellate body that does not have is not constituted, which means any decision that's taken by the first body and has been appealed is currently being stayed, and so the rules of world trade are in abeyance in so many ways. So again, the WTO still exists. It still makes rules. It still like suggests how to go about these and that kind of stuff, right? Like it still has its function. Its function is not limited, obviously, to the appellate body, right? But the decision of the appellate body is very, very important in like setting the jurisprudence of WTO. Currently, we don't have anyone on that body, and this did not start under Trump. Like I said, it started under Obama, continued under Trump, Biden 1, and up till now. So clearly, it's a country. And it's real politics, right? Like they say, you don't expect a country to act in a manner that goes against its own its interests. Yeah. So yes, the country might tell you we're rule based, or we believe in rule based order and all of that kind of stuff. But they only believe in it to the extent that it favors whatever interest that they have.
I want to take this opportunity to start getting into a bit of what the exact grievance is with China, right? Because let's roll it back. China joined the WTO just as we entered into the millennia, and China back then wasn't a very rich country. I would say much like a lot of the way African countries look like, but people did see the potential that it had as a result of its population. And the entire goal was, we don't want to isolate them, we want to bring them closer, which is an arrangement which they've done for a lot of countries, like in Africa and in Asia. Now fast forward 20 years from then, they say, hold on, this rule-based order which we created, which we sought to benefit you. You've taken advantage of it, and you've grown beyond what we did imagine, that at this point we need to treat you as a competitor, that is no longer feasible for us to just engage in sort of like talks or diplomatic relations, that we actually need to be quite aggressive in the way in which we treat you. And they mention issues like currency manipulation. They mention issues like not respecting international laws. They mention issues of climate justice, along with other human rights causalities. So it's a bit confusing. I'm wondering if you could give us some perspective, especially with the examples that you started giving, some perspective into what exactly China is being blamed for. But the key thing for me here is that isn't the entire goal of setting up these institutions to allow for nations to prosper like the way China has done? And especially looking at the African perspective, like what hope then does it give to other nations who are looking to be part of these institutions?
No, and I think you actually excellently lay out what the grievance is, if I could use that word, of America and to some extent like Europe and other countries in that region have been, right? So I guess they've just recognized that, like, okay, China has become this manufacturing behemoth that is no longer that country that you just offshore to in hopes of, okay, we found a cheaper place for labor and for labor inputs and other like inputs, other manufacturing processes. Now it has got into that country. It has become it's a country that holds, I think, more than 20% of US debt, US like treasuries, right? So that tells you a lot, right? But I guess like the way America, and this might be a wrong reading of it, but this is like my online my online reading of like the situation, right? Sure. I think America views China right now as a competitor, right? Like as a competitor in the same sense that like they view some of like their enemy combatants in the past. So they see it as a threat. They see it as like an existential threat. Maybe not an existential threat in the sense of like, okay, this country can end us, because if that happens, that's just like mutually assured destruction for the rest of all of us. But I guess they recognize that, like, okay, this is that country that quite clearly is now like a superpower with us. Again, maybe purely not on the same scale as we are, but they are a superpower in the sense of they can call the shots just the same way we can call the shots, right? So for them, it's now a question of, okay, let's look at how our trading quantum has looked like in the past. And also in recent times, the innovation advances that have been going on in China, like being able to like compete with you on the same level when it comes to like AI. We also like the frenzy when DeepSeek was released and how quickly it was released and the amount of money and all of that kind of stuff. China has been able to perfect copying and delivering in incredible amounts of time, right? So I feel like that's the fear for them. That's the fear for them. So they see this. So Europe has taken several steps back in so many ways, and I'm sure you know this better than I do. How like the joke about Europe is how everyone is innovating and Europe just ways to like regulate. So like I think like Europe in some ways is okay with just being that partner in international trade and geopolitics. But China is not content on being that, right? China is content on being that and way more. So now you start placing some of these grievances of, okay, currency manipulation, and the most ridiculous one, like I said earlier, on overproduction. The idea that a country producing to the point where it wants to like export is a problem, which throws away every single thing we've learned about comparative advantage, David Ricardo, and all these like liberal principles of like free trade. Yes. All of a sudden, it doesn't make sense. It's not something that we can live with, right? So I guess like that's the way I look at it. And then of course there are other like geopolitical issues, right? So now China has gotten to the point where it is in the race for critical minerals, for natural resources, for influence, and all of that kind of and everything, right? So just look at. Like, so a good example being the BRI, right? The Chinese, yeah, exactly, Belt Road, exactly. Yes. The way in which it has been delivered across the world, right? Even though it has not delivered on its promise on like as regards scale, but the penetration on the continent and other parts of Asia has made America recognize that, like, okay, we actually do have another country to compete with, to contend with. Because after the World War II, American, like Europe, just like fell into its doldrums, right? But of course, it quickly like came back. But Europe quickly recognize that, okay, there was a new kid on the block, and that was America. And so Europe was happy to concede in so many ways. There are people, I mean, when you read some of the literature, you recognize how America even influenced the speed of decolonization around the world, in Africa and all of that kind of stuff. Like post World War II, America was in a place to be able to like exert that level of influence on European countries to like decolonize. But at the moment, there's another kid on the block that is competing with you. So to respond to that, it's not just a question of like responding like geopolitically. It's also a question of, okay, can I look at trade? Can I look at debts? Can I look at all of these things? In my area, one of the things you keep on hearing a lot for the longest time was the myth of the Chinese debt trap. That, oh yeah, the Chinese will give you money and like next thing you know, they're taking your portion, all of those things. Surprise, surprise, that is not true. If you look at, it's not true. Like, and I had a conversation with someone. I've had a conversation several times with people on the internet, and people. And again, if I wouldn't know this if I wasn't in the field, if I wasn't in that space, because again, you have to read the literature to actually like see the truth of it. Or sometimes it's not even in the literature. Sometimes it's people who have worked on these things, transactions exactly, who can tell you, yeah. But the literature is very clear on this, like the Singapore example, the Kenyan example, all these. It's not true, right? Usually, what tends to happen is actual collateralization, right? And it's not like China has come in and just taken the ports just like that, right? So in Ghana's situation, we've collateralized some of the revenue that comes from maybe like GET fund. So the GET fund, for instance, is one of those ones that we've collateralized revenue from that. And so if you've collateralized revenue from that, maybe the contract that you have gives your creditor the right to be able to like oversee the revenue collection processes. So it's not a world where the autonomy of that country has been taken away or whatever it is. It's a revenue stream that has been collateralized that the creditor is acting on. And Chinese loans, there are several fascinating papers that have been written on this. Chinese loans do not work in the same way as other countries, right? There are so many creditors who sometimes even compete against each other, right? So, and they might be state-owned institutions or state banks or whatever it is, but it's not a situation where there's some geopolitical like agenda by the Chinese state to take over like new lands in other places. We know the countries who have done that.
Yeah, because that's the sentiment that people, like.
But that's not the case, right? Like, I mean, I'm happy to share some of these articles with people, but it's purely not the case. And like I was saying, we know the countries who have actually like taken land from people. We know who was threatening to take Greenland away from other people, even Canada, right? So so I guess like that fear or that recognition of like this new superpower, right? Some scholars say we're already in a multipolar world, right? We are no longer a unipolar world where it's just one country that gets to like do whatever it is it wants. But then what we have is like, so the other power is not, and it's not hell bent on pushing this ideological like view of the world on every single person.
Yeah. And I mean, we'll start talking about that, especially when we talk about the relationship between China and Africa and why like we seem to love them so much. But I want to like end this phase with what you think of the response from China with regards to all of these things, because I think from the beginning everyone thought China was going to go, oh, shiver me timbers, like, oh, finally America's woken up and China is going to run into the corner and things like that. But that's not what we saw. We saw that they came out and said, look, you either respect us and come to the table for us to have a proper conversation like an adult, or we are also going to pick up our arms. And they seem to bare their teeth a little bit with America. And in the last couple of days, we've seen that there are a couple of deals and negotiations which has gone on to get to reduce some of these tariffs, and the numbers are no longer crazy. But is what you're saying part of the reason why we're seeing China responding in this way? Do you think it's them feeling like they've got to the point of maturity, or that they really recognize their power and they feel like they've got America?
So I think China definitely recognizes its place in the global order of things, right? Like, so it has been able to do it. I mean, I think China has done a very good job of creating sustainable trade relations around the world. So in response to Trump's tariffs. We saw President Xi traveling in the south, in the southeast, around the Southeast Asian countries, talking to some of the Asian partners, just to build up more trade relations. Exactly, the rapport. Try to build more regional trade agreements and all of those things, just to see how they can respond to it. And I guess it probably didn't work out well for Trump by imposing tariffs on every single person, including their lasting partners, right? Like you have allies, and in responding to one country, you don't lump everyone in. Maybe that wasn't like the right thing to do. I'm sure international relations experts are probably like way better placed than I am to speak to that. But at least we seeing America coming back to the table to actually like be a bit more reasonable about this, suggests that they recognize that this is not something that's going to like hold out well for them in the long run. And we've seen the dollar not performing the way you would want the dollar to perform, right? And America, I guess they also quickly recognize that this is going to affect consumers, which is something that is basic, right? Everyone knows that tariffs is going to be paid by consumers. It's not going to be paid by the people who are exporting or the companies. And so, for instance, I don't know whether you heard about Amazon displaying the price differential between pre-tariff and like post. Exactly, yeah. They got Trump pissed off and all of that. So I guess they recognize how this is going to affect them, how it's going to affect small businesses and all of that. So I think for me, the way I see it is that like China recognizes, or China knows its strength, and so they know that they are going to hold on to their cards. And the more reasonable thing for America to do was always to come back to the table to play fairly. I don't know whether fairly is the word again, but at least to be more reasonable about how they go about like responding to some of these things, and not think they get to bully other countries. I mean, they quite clearly get to bully other countries. That it goes without saying. Like right now, if America wants to bully Ghana or like Nigeria or South Africa, there's very little you can do. That's the fact. But then you cannot bully China. At least, like that's that one country you cannot bully. So it's I don't know whether to say it's beautiful to watch, because again, Ghana is not China, and we quite clearly have not figured out what it took China to get to where they are, where they got to. And I don't know whether these are sacrifices we want to make. These are, of course, conversations that debaters have always been having about what level of liberty and economic prosperity do you want. Yes. Like, what's the trade-off over there? Like, there's, you never know what like the X amount is. But I think at the end of the day, it just tells you that like as a country, if you have your things together, if you get to the point where you keep up pace with the rest of the world, I mean, we've moved past the manufacturing phase of industrialization. Now people are doing like way more advanced things, so like technology, AI, and all that kind of stuff. But at least for countries like ours that continue to be at the mercy of Ukraine for grain imports, it's tragic. Man. It's tragic.
No, let's talk about people, and let's bring Africa into the mix, because like for example, up until quite recently, I think the cedi, the naira, were some of the worst performing currencies in the world. South Africa's economy was in rapid decline, especially after the Ukraine war, and it didn't help, right? Like the lining up of all of these massive, some things which just happens once in a generation. Somehow all of it got packaged into a couple of years. COVID, Ukraine-Russian war, and then now these tariffs, and then we're seeing the whirlwind that's going on. Of course, we've seen some of the socio-political spillovers that we've had in terms of the number of political coups, in terms of the way the election cycles in themselves have gone, in terms of the mass migration numbers which we've seen in those countries. What would you quantify as the effect that some of these interactions and some of these tangles which you are talking about, how is it?
I really like how you explain it, like, and the word, like you really explain the word like polycrisis. It's a very like fanciful term that academics like using these days. It's a very fancy. Like even last week there was a polycrisis conference over here with all these academics talking about it. It's very interesting. But perfect. You perfectly like describe like the polycrisis and how the crisis of our times is really like complicated. You have like mix of all these things like playing out at the same time, and countries are being, and the most a very pivotal part of it also is debt, and the debt crisis that like countries are being faced with. I mean, so since COVID, we've seen the backlash, right? The economies have gone to shit, if I can use that word, right? Like for so many countries. Thankfully, like so many a good number of the countries are like rebounding. At least Ghana is currently like on a good rebound, and we hope like it's sustained for the long term. And hopefully, exactly, I know, right? Yeah. But I think what that means for African countries again is to recognize like that failure of leadership over a very long period of time. And I use that carefully because it's not just leadership. So a lot of these things are also very external. So like with debt, for instance, we know at least for now, we know how pivotal the credit rating agencies, for instance, are in the entire debt architecture, and the way, and there have been allegations of these credit rating agencies being biased against African countries or global South countries, and the way that just hikes up the premium you have to pay, like your interest rate and all of those things, right? So for me, and from where I sit, what all of this means for African countries is to recognize the need for some multilateral like response to some of these issues. So the AfCFTA was a good example, or a good example of how African countries can respond to this. Unfortunately, we are still not seeing significant levels of trade under like the AfCFTA. I don't know the exact number, but like it's very minimal amount. Yeah, very small amounts of like trading. Still don't see how like, and it's incredible to me because you have this continent of like 54 countries, over 1 billion people, and all what you need to do is to reduce all these barriers, these artificial barriers you've placed along the line that prevents you. So from borders, tariffs, flight, like it's actually very exasperated because like we have and this I've in as much as I've taken like a leftist turn in my outlook on life in recent times, I'm also quite scared. And again, I also see the value of like Pan-Africanism and all of that. But there's a big part of me that continues to be exasperated by our failure to capture the promise of like Pan-Africanism and the opportunities that presents for us. However, what that continues to mean for us is that debt servicing is just going to continue being like very high. At the moment, there are so many countries on the continent that spend way more on debt servicing than they do on health and education. And that's just insane. And usually you are just paying. I mean, in addition to you paying money to maybe like the California pension or whatever it is, you're also a huge chunks of those monies are going to private equity firms or hedge funds or whatever it is in places like Connecticut and Vermont. Like, right, a small number of people are taking up all these interest payments that like African countries are making. So that's where we currently are, right? So we currently are at a place where we've not figured out the debt architecture very well. That's one. Two, the promise of democracy continues to not live up to its expectation. And that's why in the sub-region, people like Ibrahim Traore continue to have like the hype that they have. I don't want to talk too much about him because maybe somebody will just like take a clip out of this and like bash me on the internet. But I'm very skeptical about people who come on the scene in camouflage and all what they promise is this idea of, oh, the West is bad, the West is bad, the West is bad. Don't get me wrong. There's a lot to criticize about the West, right? And that's like a big chunk of my research. A big chunk of my research is just looking at this idea of like transnational capitalist class of people and how they extract from developing countries and all of that. But there's a big part of that also that we also need to look at, like agency of African leaders, right? And so for me, in as much as like democracy has not been able to like live up to its expectation and all of that kind of stuff, the alternative is never this new crop of leaders or new crop of like strong men that we are seeing on the continent. Because one, if you listen closely, you don't see an alternative vision being given, right? The alternative vision is basically, okay, let's pivot from America or France to China and Russia. And that's still imperialism, right? That's still new imperialism. Because again, like in Burkina Faso, if you look at like the last time I was having, again, me being a chatterbox, I was having a banter with someone on Facebook about, they were talking about how like, oh yeah, he's nationalizing all their natural resources and all of that kind of stuff. And you go look at it, he's given the mining rights to a Russian company, and all like the Burkina Faso government is getting something like 20 or 25% from this. If you look at what the Ghanaian government gets from some of this, like gold and oil, whatever it is, like we get way more, you know. So this idea of, oh, democracy has not delivered on this promise, so let's give it to a select group of strong men. Let's outsource our thinking and our agency to a select group of strong men to do all the thinking and the decision making for us. Like it will never say what will be. So like that's one angle of it. And then obviously, so yeah, like that's democracy, the promise of democracy, and in recent times, like the insecurity that we are seeing from the Sahel region coming down, which again ties into the question of democracy. Like again, look at these countries and look at how jihadists are taking up ground in these places, right? Like it's, I don't know. It's, to me, it's not like that cannot be the alternative. The alternative for me has to be true democracy, right? True democracy in the sense of whoever it is that's leading us is truly representative of us, and it has to be through the ballot. Like the idea that there's another system of governance that is better than this one where we have a say in how we are ruled or governed through the ballots. Like there's no better alternative to me. Yeah.
So no, I think it's super interesting. Perhaps this is one of the things which we must create a different episode and speak about, because I also have strong thoughts. But I think what's striking to me is you pointing out that this is a snake oil which has been sold on the continent so many times, and that there needs to be a credible alternative. Because I think what we are not realizing is that the world is becoming multipolar, and it looks like instead of finding a unique way of being able to interact in that world, we have just traded one master for the other. So I want to start looking at this by looking at the history of the Bretton Woods institutions, like in terms of are we still roped in those kind of ventures? Like, because for those who don't know the Bretton Woods institutions, like we're talking about the IMF, we're talking about the WTO, like all of these institutions which were supposed to come in and then sort of conduct a new world order. But however, we saw, just like you mentioned, the massive amounts of debt which we've racked under them, where they introduced policies like some of these structural adjustment programs, which like completely obliterated African institutions. So when we see some of these sentiments, I begin to wonder, are we aware that these things are still working, or are we aware that we are still operating under some of these things, and are we aware of the massive impacts which they are beginning to have on us?
You actually put it very well. Like the last bit of your question is so pregnant, in the sense that there's some level of like unawareness about how the way we currently are can directly be traced back to this specific point in time where post World War II, leaders of the world, leaders of the world, the Western world, and some of like the newly decolonized world, like places like India, but like of course with significantly less like agency from some of these like decolonized countries, got together in a place in the USA, Bretton Woods, to chat up, okay, how should the rest of history look like? And so when they met in Bretton Woods, I think in 1945, if I'm not mistaken, the goal was 3, right? So the UN, so again, when it comes to like security, world peace, and all that kind of stuff, the thought was, okay, like, let's leave that with the UN, let's leave that with a political body to make those decisions. But then the Bretton Woods institution, their goal, so 3 institutions came out of Bretton Woods, right? So the first one was the IMF, whose goal was more of like monetary policy issues, right? Like balance of payments, stability. How do we get a world where countries are not fixing their exchange rate and playing with currency, playing with like their monetary policy to give them unfair advantages against other countries? So that was like with the IMF. And the World Bank was, at the time, it was International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the IBRD. The goal with them was, okay, how do we rebuild the post-war Europe and like other parts of the world that had been decimated. And then you had the GATT, General Agreement on Trade and Tariff, if I'm not mistaken, where the goal was also like, okay, we need to get to a point where we reduce tariffs, we reduce all the barriers to trade significantly. So the GATT did not play out. GATT did not become WTO until I think 1989, if I'm not mistaken, like way later. But the IMF and the World Bank were able to like materialize and manifest themselves. For our purposes, for African purposes, we can jump quickly from 1945 to our post-independence era. So like let's use the example of Ghana, for instance. So with Ghana, after independence, we had some amount, we had a good amount of external reserves, largely because, of course, the British were exporting our every single thing that we're making, exporting it, selling it, and like keeping the reserves externally. So there was a good amount of reserves that Nkrumah could like fall back on to build a country. I'm not saying it was sufficient. Obviously, it was nowhere sufficient because like the infrastructural deficit that Nkrumah had was incredible, which is also true for most African countries. It was nowhere sufficient, but it was some amount that he could start something with. So yeah, Nkrumah was using that for his industrial policy, and we know his several 7-year policies and all like the things he put in place. So we get to sometime in the 60s where and this is for the purposes of Ghana, sometime in the 60s where the reserves have gone down. We've started like borrowing externally. We borrowed to start Akosombo Dam and a number of other like projects that we had. So the Akosombo Dam was the World Bank, the American government, Cosmos, and I think Cosmos was, I can't remember, but like some companies. We also began to depend heavily on suppliers' credits, which was how we're financing our consumables, so then our imported consumables and all of that kind of stuff. So when our fiscal situation got bad, the Nkrumah government approached the IMF. So that was the first like IMF approach. So the Nkrumah government approached the IMF, I think in 65, if I'm not mistaken, either 65 or 66. So he approaches them, but then, and again, the IMF is very big on balance of payments stability, right? Ensuring that your imports and your exports, like the amount you are paying for these things, equalize, right? And so for them, that means what level of cuts can we do to the provision of public service and some of these other things to ensure that you're not spending way too much that you actually are making to be able to meet your imports in situations where your exports are not meeting your imports. But the proposals were too much for Nkrumah, and Nkrumah being a socialist and heavily on social spending, he said no to that. So the Nkrumah government did approach the IMF, but then the terms were bad. He said no to that, and immediately after his overthrow, the NLC that took over again went to approach them, and they said yes to the IMF's raft of policies, which included devaluing the currency and a number of other things, right? So that happens. The Busia government takes over, they continue with our program, and that ends up being one of like the Achilles heels of the Busia government, right? Like, so the devaluation was too much that like it also caused his overthrow. And another big part of it was also the inability to import stuff. I think it's one of the things I found interesting was that at every point in time, all the coups that Ghana has had, a big part of it has been the inability of the government to import consumables. Ghanaians, we like chilling. We really like chilling. So it's why one of my privately held theories is that we probably are not going to see a coup in a world where we continue to have access to some of these consumables. I don't know. And this is not me undermining Ghana's political like awareness and that kind of stuff. But I just think like it takes a lot more to get Ghanaians to be like, okay, this experiment with the government, we cannot wait till 4 years. I don't know, like that's how I feel. That's my feeling of it. But yeah, quickly, that's just me sidetracking. So we keep on doing this. We keep on having this like tango with the IMF and that kind of stuff. But then the IMF as an institution gets to a point where they recognize that like the disbalance of payments thing that they are doing, it's not enough, right? They need to them. The problem is that like there are specific structures in these economies that do not allow them to actually achieve these balance of payments, like balance of payment stability that they want, equilibrium that they want. And so they start this thing of structural adjustment programs around the world, right? Where it's like, okay, let's go to these countries let's not just send policies, right? Let's actually have a presence in these countries where we change the structure, like the actual structure of so both the economy, delivery and all, social service delivery and all of that stuff, right? Let's push a new ideology on these countries. This was also influenced at the same time, like, so there was a lot of like that influence also coming from the neoliberal influence in America, right? People like von Mises, Hayek, and all these guys, and the experiments in Chile, where it was like this thing they call the Washington Consensus. Let's liberalize trade, let's privatize economies, and let's take the states away from let's create the free markets, right? Let the price level be reflective of the level of demand and supply and all those kind of things. And that created significant social dislocations. So for a country like Ghana, and we I think we started like so Ghana's structural adjustment program started in 1983, and again this was under like the Rawlings government, which is very interesting. So there's a whole intellectual history behind that. I mean, the Rawlings government being so even though Rawlings himself is not purely leftist, but he had a lot of like leftist elements in his government, right? So there was an intellectual tussle between people like Kwesi Butri and other truly leftist, hardcore leftists who were like, no, we don't want to do this Washington Consensus program, right? And at the same time, in our neighboring country, Burkina Faso, Sankara was also like resisting that. So like there were some level of like resistance from other places, but in Ghana, we signed on to that. I don't think it's right to make a value judgment of it, because again, there needs to be the recognition that the country was in a bad place at the time. Like there was a need to be able to like get the resources that we needed. Like, I mean, like I said, the consumables were not available. We're not able to like go on the international. The needle and all those things were not available. We're not able to like import fuel. Like the basic necessities that we needed were horrible. And I don't know, people growing up, I used to hear something called the 83 com. Like that was the famine, exactly, So all of these things, this confluence of like issues were happening at the same time. So it might be unfair to sit in the comforts of 2025 and be critical of some of these things in the past, but it's also necessary for us to like look at it from a critical perspective of, okay, this has happened. How do we engage with it and recognize how we've gotten to where we've gotten to? So we signed on to the structural adjustment program. And basically, we liberalize our country. We remove tariffs. We remove import quotas. We devalue our currency significantly. We have serious cuts to the civil service. Like a lot of people were sacked were laid off and that kind of stuff. Exactly. Yes, there was significant privatization. That was where there was a lot of like divestiture of state assets and all of those things, right? So all of that happened. And so from 83 downwards, you created a world on the continent and in so many parts of the global south where the expectation of people on the government had changed, right? So even though, for instance, like we had never truly had the provision of like public transportation, the state in previous times had always tried to like respond to that, right? So that the state from Chroma, all of those times, that had always made a conscious recognition that like public transportation needs to be a public service. But once you have the structural adjustment program, then the logic changes. The logic now becomes the states need to take a step out of that space and it needs to leave it to private forces to provide these services. Same for education, same for healthcare. So that's why you have stuff like cash and carry, where like this period of like when you go to the hospital, you pay before you actually get So that logic was established where it was that like the states need to take a step out of these pieces. And then when it comes to public debts, you also created this situation where now the state was going on the money market to borrow. And then you also created also like a capital market where like the state was also going there to like raise issue bonds and all of those things. So a logic of privatization happened, and out of that logic, I believe it's what we had with our 1992 constitution, right? So the World Bank and the IMF, right? One of the things they did was this idea of this conception of rule of law and constitutionalism, where it was like. Exactly, it was a requirement for the program. And you see, sometimes another way to look at some of these institutions is that sometimes it's not like, the transmission of ideas happens very directly, where it's like, okay, you used to do it this way. There's also this bit where specific people trained in these institutions are the ones who become the elites who create some of these things. So a good example for me is I think Nana SKB Asante. He used to work at the World Bank, and he was part of the people who were like the drafters of our constitution, right? Yeah. So that logic of that logic or that way of thinking about how to constitutionalize exactly, it ends up like finding footing in your constitution. And so you have a constitution which in its ethos, in its thinking, is very much pro private capital, pro free markets. And one of the things for me too is that like you create a world where you create a constitutional order where the legislators, even though they are the ones who are the true representatives of the people, their power is significantly curtailed by the courts in something we call constitutionalism. Whether or not that's a good thing is a dicey thing. Yes. But the problem with that for me is what we are currently seeing today, where we've created a world where the courts are very powerful, that parliament can make a decision and the courts can override it. Yes. And say it is unconstitutional because it goes against the spirit or the letter of the 1992 Constitution. I think what that ends up doing is that for things that are truly political, right, and political in the sense of this is exactly we decide ourselves. These are issues of power, and so they are contested issues, right? There are contested interests at play. We take that away from the space of like actual politics, right, where we actually need to decide it, and we locate it in the courts. And we give the courts too much power. So you see that now we're at a point where in the last administration at least, people were saying, oh, every decision from the courts is unanimous decision, blah, 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 blah. Because you've gotten to a point where now people are like, okay, no, this body has way too much power. They're making too many decisions on our behalf. So now we need to contest it. So now that's why the partisanship has also like entered the Supreme Court, and now it's become like another like locus for.
Yeah,
exactly. It's a new battleground for that. And so, right? Going back to the point you were making about being aware of how we've gotten to where we've gotten to, I think we always need to go back to 83 and think about what changed. Another good example is Galamsey. So, mining had largely been a state, it had largely been a preserve of the state. And then in 1991, or I can't remember the year, but as part of the structural adjustment programs, the states had to liberalize the mining sector. And that was where we started getting the private sector participation. Yeah. AGOA Ashanti. Now, when AGOA Ashanti came in, right, you created social dislocations. You created a world where communal people who had been mining in the past now had been disenfranchised. So there were some contestations. And in response to that, small-scale mining was given legislative recognition. And so from that point, once that recognition was given and some support was given to small-scale miners, then you had an influx in that area. So the states had taken a step away. Large-scale miners from outside the country came in, and then indigents who felt they had been economically disenfranchised now had to resort to other like very cheap way of doing things. Then the Chinese influx happens, and then now we are where we are with like things like Changfang and like very destructive ways of doing things. For me, I think because we have that neoliberal logic of the state should not be present, the state at the moment has no interest in actually mining and actually extracting. And so that's why at the moment you have Gold Board, where the state doesn't want to extract, but the state wants to buy. And you still, but the incentive to engage in illegal mining still exists, because if you are buying, and you've not showed us any ethical sourcing, any ethical supply chain sourcing. There's no communication on that whatsoever. So for instance, you tell us the previous government issued X amount of licenses, right? But then you come in and you tell us, oh, since we came in, we've bought this amount of gold, way more than like the previous government was buying. Have you shown us who you bought that gold from, and whether they held the license or not? Right?
I'm trying to play the devil's advocate here. Isn't the logic here now is that by making the states the sole buyer, you sort of like
a monopoly?
Create it's not a monopoly. I've forgotten the exact.
A monopoly.
Yes, of sorts, where they can now dictate what the supply chains in itself would be. So isn't it that we are likely going to see that happening in the long run?
No. So I mean, So I think the opportunity exists for the states to do that, right? The opportunity definitely exists. Like that arrangement gives the states the opportunity to be like, okay, since I'm the only one buying, I'm going to buy from this specific persons who are able to like establish that kind of stuff. But at the moment, the state has not shown us any interest in like ethical sourcing of that. But also, gold is so easy to smuggle. Like even cocoa that like is like huge bags. People that also like smuggle it out, right? And like and a lot of these things also happen like in border towns. Like it's so easy for people to just like literally like walk across borders in their pockets and just like so. I mean, I don't think.
I have examples where like people employ the indigents and then give them
exactly. Exactly, yeah. And like smuggling of gold has always been like a crime in the country. It's actually, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's punishable by death. I would have to cross check. Exactly, yeah. So like it's always been like whatever it is like you want to take care of, has always been criminalized, right? But I think for me, it just goes back to that neoliberal logic of the state needs to take a step out of the markets and allow private institutions to take up these things, right? But then private institutions are very terrible actors, right? The incentive is always profit.
Not to even stop your flow over there. Like, I think this is very much of a revealing moment also for me, because we are aware of the history in terms of the oral history and how it is told in homes and in a storied fashion, but not always from a lens. From an academic lens where we're looking at the things that happen. But the key thing here for me that I wanted to point out to you to give me your observation on was it's not just about private institutions being evil, but then also we see no local private institutions that like the specific decimation of all of our local industries and all of our local institutions. The biggest employers in the 1990s were still the Nestle's,
Unilever, all of those ones, exactly, yeah.
What do you call it? The tuna fish companies, who were mostly in the industrial towns, whilst the rural areas focused on agriculture. And then when they all decided that this country was no longer profitable and they left, till today we are still dealing with chronic unemployment because we do not have employers of skill anymore.
And very valid, right? Like, because. Valid, right? Like, because, we just talk about China, and we've seen what China has been able to do, and how like the Chinese model was never the state needs to like totally exit the whatever space it was, right? Like, there's a way to do capitalism that recognizes how important the state is in the delivery of services, right? And sometimes, and so many times, the response you get is like, oh, the state is so inefficient. Whenever they do is like they are corrupt and whatever it is. But like that, I don't think that's a sufficient answer, because when you set up your economy or your society in a manner that rewards that, right? That rewards that level of like corruption and all of those things. Then that's when you continue to get what you get. Chinese state-owned enterprises are some of like the largest in the world. Aramco makes way more money than even Apple.
Yes.
And Aramco is state-owned, right? Like there's a world where the state continues to own, like hold significance like equity, but then it can always maybe like outsource management to whoever it is. Like a country like Singapore, we know. When Singapore is employing for some roles, they even advertise it in The Economist. And Singapore is like one of the most like educated countries in the world. Like Singaporeans, like they are smart people. And so even with them, when they are recruiting for specific like agencies or whatever for roles, they look out for like the best talents like available in the world. So you cannot reward your foot soldiers with the jobs, and then turn around and come and cry that, oh, the state is an inefficient player. And again, this is not limited to any party, of course. Like, this is something that is like endemic in Ghanaian society. Like, this is not like most of these are endemic in Ghanaian societies. So for me, it's just a problem. It's deliberate. It's deliberate. Like this, women have something they call weaponized incompetence, where it's like a man will intentionally act like he doesn't know how to do something just so like the wife comes, that kind of stuff, right? And that's what it is. I think it's purely weaponized incompetence. It's they intentionally are incompetent just so they allow their cronies to take up whatever it is private space exists, and then they turn around and make deals with some of these guys. So for me, going back to the question, is this chain of events that have happened over the period that has culminated in this Ghana that we currently have, where, like, housing, for instance, there's no incentive on the part of the state to provide affordable housing. And affordable housing, when we say affordable housing, right, affordable housing is a term of art. Like, it has a specific meaning. When you look at like some of the literature, like it says your commute. So if for it to be affordable housing, apparently you shouldn't spend more than 30% of your yearly income on it. So like whatever mortgage payment, way more than that. Yeah. Your commute time apparently should not be more than an hour, if I'm not mistaken. Like there's specific. I'm very careful because I'm not trying to make this partisan or political. But I don't think when you build house, so let me not even mention whatever housing unit it is, but you don't build housing units far away from the city center where everyone works and you call it affordable housing, especially when like people will end up paying more than 60% of their salaries on that. For me, what we should be doing, if we have not corrupted our mind with this idea of profits, and even the state being profit-centered, is that all these houses, all these states, like government lands that we see in places like Jolu, cantonments, all these places, that's what affordable housing should be happening, bro. Like, you should be putting those houses over there. Yeah. Make it affordable. Like see these 6-story houses and that kind of stuff. Like, people like Ichampon were conscious about that. Yeah. They were building Redco housing, they were building Smith, that kind of stuff. But we've come 1992, Fourth Republic. Up till now, we cannot do like actual, because in a world where you are building houses in Jolu, in cantonments, some of these places, Tesano. Imagine houses at cantonments. Most people, of course, work in like Central Accra, those ministries and all those places, right? Makola. Yeah. What traffic situation are you dealing with? You're not dealing with nature, but like right now, people have to wake up at like 5 a.m. Like, you see the videos of people waking up at 5 a.m. from Kaswa to go to Accra, like sitting in traffic, like 3 hours, 4 hours. It's so unhealthy.
I want to. There was this period, like I think, especially during Mohammed's first term, where we saw like the state coming with big infrastructure.
A very long time, true.
Which we hadn't seen in a very, very long time. I mean, Kufuor's period was still more of the government's policies, like, and where you saw a bit of the states now coming in and trying to cater for some of these social institutions. And I think you saw it also around Africa, like countries just began to adopt more of these social intervention schemes. But then you also saw all of a sudden huge investments in infrastructure, which was greeted with a lot of applause because we had not seen those things beyond the time of Kwame Nkrumah. But shortly after, we began to hear news of our debt ballooning, of our national debt ballooning, and it seems to have now dominated the national discussion. And that's where some of the stereotypes around some of these loans from China came in, because people now said, well, we've given up all of our resources to China. Part of it gets roped into the Galamsey conversation. It gets roped into every other conversation. And now you've seen the appetite for infrastructure projects decrease slightly a little bit, which also now comes with limited investment within those nations. I wanted you to sort of like give us a bit. Was this the right step we're taking, not to validate any political institution? Because like I said, this was across Africa. Was this the right step for us in terms of going back to the States?
So I think that period that you're talking about, mainly around like 2009 all the way to like 2011, 2012-ish, that was like the Africa Rising like period where there was a lot of like enthusiasm around the world for the prospects of Africa, and a lot of that was also like on the back of commodity prices, right? And that's one of the problems of our. That's one of the biggest themes of our development story, where it's like when commodity prices are on the high, obviously, like, I mean, more receipts, better revenues, all of that kind of stuff, and so like people are very excited. And then also, credits is very friendly coming into your country and all of that. But also on the back of all of that is also the issue of the 2008-2009 global financial crisis, and that's one of the questions, one of the stories of capital globally. Where if in America or in the Western world there's a crisis, there's a recession, capital, because in places where like these recessions are happening, right, the interest rate is very low. So capital now is looking around the world to see, okay, where can I go and get more money? Where can I get more return? And so if the interest rates, if the Fed rates in America is say maybe like 1% or like 0% or like I think it was significantly low. Exactly, yes, it was. Yeah, at some point it was even like negative or whatever it was, right? Yeah. Exactly. So in such instances, what you end up having is that now capital start looking around the world to see, okay, where can I go and get more money? Exactly, the portfolio, like exactly. You are the finance guy. You know this better than I do. So when we saw these things on the continent, it was on the back of some of these things, right? There were cheaper loans that were available to African countries. Ghana first went on the Eurobond in 2007. And so this was a time when, considerably the access to credit was easier. And so if access to credit is easier, your revenue from commodity exports is also like really good and all of that kind of stuff. You've had a good bumper season. I think in 2009, that was the first time we had we exported 1 million tons of cocoa, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. Cocoa exports, exactly. Yeah. So all of these things playing together resulted in like this huge receipts. And so when you have huge receipts like this, it's easier for you to invest in infrastructure, right? So we did see that. And obviously to clarify, in as much as the state has taken a step back from so many things, the state has still recognized that like it needs to de-risk investments by providing these infrastructure, right? Even in America and some of these places, like things like road, bridges, highway, it's a public good. No private actor is going to like provide such public goods because there's literally like nothing for them unless of course they can like charge tolls and all of those. So I think this was what was happening. But Ghana's debt story for me has been like, going back to the SAP, right? So I think when we first went for the structural adjustment loans in the 80s, at that time we're not, even though we're indebted and we couldn't get access to credit, we're not like deeply indebted, right? We're not like indebted to the point like the levels were not high, but then we also were a country that we're not producing that much. Our GDP was significantly low, so that was the problem. But then so that first wave of structural adjustment loans gave us it made us very indebted, all the way up to the early 2000s, where we became a highly indebted poor country, right? And then we went for the HIPC, exactly. A funny story about HIPC. So we qualified for HIPC under Rawlings, but Rawlings refused to go for HIPC because the Japanese had threatened, maybe the word is not threatened, but they had said they're not going to continue giving any country any more money, any more loans or grants if they sign up for the HIPC, because the HIPC was going to require the major shareholders of the IMF and the World Bank to forgive good amounts of like loans, right? So like they were like, so the Japanese said no, and so under Rawlings we did not go for it. But when Kufuor came, he quickly signed on to HIPC. So we got HIPC debt forgiveness. So once we got a HIPC debt forgiveness, our books looked very well, right? Because again, I think more good amounts. I think it's more than 37% or so. Like a good amount of our loan had been forgiven. Yeah, more than 50% if I'm not mistaken. So once it gets cleared off, your books looks nice. You're able to like go on the commercial market to borrow. So we started that in 2007 under the NDC. Both Mills and Mahama, we do some amounts of like borrowing. But then under the NPP, we borrowed way more. Like we borrowed a lot. Like from 2017 to like 2021, if I'm not mistaken. Like we borrowed a lot. Like we went on the Eurobond market like significantly. Yeah. So that was really bad, right? And then COVID happened. So usually when people give the explanation of COVID, the explanation is to the effect that it created disruptions in other countries that ended up affecting us. Because when COVID happened and the global economy came to a halt, the Fed increased the Fed rate, right? I think it came to like 5.4% or so. Exactly. And that also affected us. So that made our bonds like very, very unattractive. Exactly.
It affects the debt levels.
Exactly.
Right?
So because I think there had been a period where we were heavily dependent on refinancing our loans by going for more Eurobonds. So if like that 2021 or 2022 issuance had worked out well, we wouldn't be where we are right now. But once that happened, our currency tanked. And then, of course, so once that happened, you realize that like, okay, this country's bond is too expensive compared to the treasury bills, the US treasury bills. People would start dumping your bonds. Your currency is no longer attractive. And then your CD moves from 4.2 to 10 CDs or whatever it is that happened. So this chain of facts ends up like resulting in like our debts being super like unsustainable. But and this is not me like making excuses, because the fact is that we were borrowing like at an unsustainable level. It was very, very unsustainable. Our strategy had become more of go on the international markets, borrow, come and refinance your loan, and continue doing that on the hopes of, oh, you have other like natural resources and like cocoa and all of those things that you're going to use to like refinance. And but like quite clearly, COVID showed us that like this was not an economy whose fundamentals were good, and we got exposed really, really terribly, and they ended up the fundamentals were very, very weak. Yeah. So I mean, so like basically that's my research, right? So like my research looks at some of these things, right? Like, but I also try to make the argument that these things are also not just a question. So like you cannot take away the complicity of like your Ministry of Finance, your presidency, and all of those things, right? Like this is your strategy, and your strategy quite clearly was not a good fiscal strategy. But also the international debt architecture is structured in a way that's, or like the global exactly, it doesn't, right? Like if you're so there's the Volcker effect, this idea that if the US Federal Reserve hikes up its rates, it has like ripple effects around the world, and it can affect your economy, right? The Volcker effect then means that like there are external factors that are beyond the control of developing countries like ours, because like they say in finance, or at least in international finance law, the original sin for global south countries is that they're not able to like issue debts in their own currency. Yeah, you can issue some debts, but like the most part of it is not going to be in your own currency. But if it was in your own currency, at least you can always like, even though like printing is not good, like but like your ability to engage in quantitative easing is like significantly like restricted. So there's that question, but there's also like the other question of like the creditors also should bear some level of like responsibility for all of these things, because reasonably when you are lending to a developing country, you expect this. So there's for instance there's an analysis that was undertaken by this body called Debt Jubilee that showed that even with the restructuring that we've done, our Eurobond and all of those things, our creditors are still better off than even like the domestic debt creditors, right? So it's not a thing where even in the face of like the restructuring and all of that, we are like, restructuring is not cheating. Like you're not cheating a creditor out of whatever it is. One, morally, the creditor should have known. Like, I mean, you assume those costs, you assume those risks. It's just like if exactly it's what you charge exactly even to begin with, right? Exactly. Yeah. So it's not something that like you should like. So those are some of like the moral, like the justice concerns that I'm looking at from like a point of view of like international law, that like does international law have anything to do in some of these instances? Yeah.
Wow, this is crazy. Like I like where we've gone to in a sense, because it does look like the tariffs also coming out. It has understanding the context in which African nations in themselves are, understanding our over-reliance on natural resource exploitations, and then understanding that tariffs are going to be slapped on all of these things. Just shows that the level of downward pressure that it will be applied on these economies. What my questioning as we are coming to a close here is, what should be the strategy for Africa, especially what's the kind of war that's likely going to be created here, as we're seeing a tussle between these two superpowers? Is there an opportunity for us to get ahead here? What should be our strategy moving forward if we want to take a seat at the head of the table? Because it's obvious that Nigeria can't continue depending on oil, Ghana can't.
I've gotten to the I've got to the point where I think we need to just look at, just reopen like the development theory books all over again and recognize that, you know how they talk about I think it's the Lewis model also, if I'm not mistaken. I've forgotten my economics. But like the idea that like you move from agriculture, manufacturing before you get to services, right? I think even both agriculture and manufacturing, we've not done it enough.
Yeah.
And then like now we are heavily invested in like on the service part of it, right? And so when things like the Ukraine-Russia war happens, you cannot import, you don't have greens in your country. Like incredibly.
It's crazy for the 21st
like it's always like it always like,
crazy
and so that's why
like,
sometimes when I see some of these stories of corruption, what pisses me off the most about it is that when the money is stolen, all what some of these guys allegedly do is to just go buy houses, cars, and keep the money in like Dubai. I feel like if first of all, don't steal. But if you're going to steal, please go and open a yam farm, maize farm, tomatoes. Like these really are like the basic things that, because you see, egg is like 65 cedis a crate. That's what I heard, if I'm not mistaken. Like, you cannot live in a country where the one protein that people make fun of you around the world for is inaccessible to majority of your people. Like it's incredible to me. Like you and I are over here, right? And we know how I don't know, it's how affordable food is. Like food is never like the one thing that like you're worried about. But this is a country that like majority of its people are in agriculture, but it's still unable to like feed itself. So for me, I think the lesson from like the last couple of years, the last 20 years, and most importantly, the last 4, 8, 10, 12, whatever number of years is that like we need to go back to the basics, right? Digitalization is great. We need to we need to be like literacy, like AI, all of that kind of stuff is great. But we need to be able to feed ourselves. Like I'm very crude about this. We need to first of all be able to feed ourselves. After being able to feed ourselves sufficiently, then we can start thinking about, okay, what parts of the manufacturing architecture can we like fit ourselves in, right? I love that like this current government is really prioritizing like the apprenticeship program. I think it's really great because I mean I'm over here and I see how apprenticeship has grown to the point where there are even routes for lawyers, for people to become lawyers through apprenticeships. It's amazing because like it's just people just recognize that like not everyone wants to go to university and do like a 3-4 year program. It's lovely, but I would love to see this built on an industrial policy. I would really love to see like an industrial policy blueprint that tells us that like, okay, this is where we are trying to get to. Because like just like with one district, one factory, to me I think there wasn't. Yeah, like it wasn't built on like an industrial policy where it was like this is how we want to get to, right? There's this book I read about the political economy of industrialization in Ghana and how all these government programs have missed out on it. And it comes back to two very basic things, right? It says one, we don't have a domestic capitalist elite group where you have people who have money who are willing to industrialize. And then also we have a competitive clientelism system which means there are so many different groups of people who just want short-term gains. And so, for instance, if a state wants to like Kufuor's presidential special initiative on like maybe things like cassava and those kind of things, right? Because you don't have a domestic capitalist elite that has the money or the credit to be able to like invest in like the skill that you need to be actually like get like the right level of cassava to be able like export or whatever it is. And also you have domestic systems like your chieftaincy system or like your political party. Exactly, yeah, those social institutions that you use to underpin it to build some of these things. Because we don't have these things, industrialization has continuously failed, even all the way from like the Nkrumah era, right? From like his 7-year policy and all of those things. So I think we need to like go back to like the drawing books to actually like ask some of these like 101 questions that like, okay, what is the political economy of these things in your country? Like what social structures, what fiscal structures, social structures, whatever, like knowledge systems do you currently have that allows or do not allow for some of these things? For me, that's what I feel like we should be asking, right? The America-China war, or whatever it is that we want to call it, we benefit from whatever it is to the extent that we are beneficial to these countries. So in Congo, for instance, we currently see that because the Americans have a huge craze for the critical minerals, right? And like they've lost that race to the Chinese. they are now extending military support to the Congolese government against the Rwandans and exactly that kind of stuff.
Wow.
Exactly, right?
Rwanda.
Interest all over again, right?
Long-term
So
friends,
you
right?
never know. I mean, now that we have lithium in this country, that we've been told we have lithium, maybe if we find another natural critical mineral that the Americans or whoever it is thinks is very important, they will pitch to us. So I guess on that front, I just think as a country, right? I always say we are a small coastal economy on the continent of Africa. Like truly, we don't matter in the grand scheme of the world. No, like I really want us to like accept that fact, right? So we matter maybe like culturally in some instance, right? Like yeah, we matter to the African American diaspora. We matter.
Yeah.
Afrobeats, some of these things, like Jollof Wars and that kind of stuff. But bro, beyond that, like when I hear people talking about, oh, we need to have our own AI, I'm like, guy, you've not fed yourself. You're talking about AI. You're talking about AI policy. Like, we need to be honest with ourselves about these things. Like, we need to be able to truly go back and like ask those questions. Like, so many countries have done that. They've recognized their comparative advantage and they've exploited that. Like, look at Vietnam, look at Singapore. Like, I always talk about Singapore. Like, Singapore is just like an amazing story, and I think so many of us need to be able to like read about it. And like, for instance, do you know they do politics, hardcore politics over there, but their politics is it's not a type where, I don't want to mention names, but it's not a type where the kind of characters that we see masquerading around in our politics, right? Like, you're not going to see them in Singapore. These are people who they went to Cambridge, MIT, Yale, like some of the smartest people you can find everywhere. Exactly.
Some of
right,
them
like no, it's not. What's his name? Shenguli, exactly, yes, grandson of
Shenguli.
Like these are like the kind of people who like are doing politics in that country, right? So we can learn from some of these countries and see what we can take from that. But I think at the end of the day, for me, Charlie, let them fight. The two of them, whatever is left, we can ride on that. But then we need to go back.
Yeah, if it's an interest, I mean, what I take from your submission is that if it's an interest-based world, then you need to build that interest and make it appealing. Because if there's a world where people are competing for what you have, the most valuable, the most effective strategy is to be valuable in the first place. And that's why you had like she going around to the southeastern nations trying to lobby them. You still have Trump trying to go into the Arab countries trying to lobby them. And if we were to position ourselves very well within Africa, people would want to.
Just quickly, I just wanted to just like you said, like just the word position. I was just thinking about like just even like geographic positioning, right? It's so important in this world, right? Look at countries like Ethiopia. Okay, Egypt is like a perfect example of like how like geographic positioning can just make you like so important in the world. So like one, you have the Suez Canal, which is very important when it comes to like logistics in the world. Two, you are close to the Middle East, like just by mere presence, its proximity to Israel and all of that kind of stuff. What that has meant for Egypt is that like when it comes to like aid, when it comes to trade, when it comes to debt forgiveness, like America treats Egypt as like it's like they get like the best of deals. They get like the best of deals because like there's a recognition of that. But we as a country, we are not that kind of country. That's why for me, when I look at some of like the Ibrahim Traore conversations, I'm always like, it's very curious to me because like geographically, like what do people think this country like presents? You know, and again, this is not me shitting on that country. Right? I think like it's an important country. Like every country is important, but like when you look at just geopolitics, like what's your offer? You know, that kind of stuff. And so like I think as a country we just need to be honest with ourselves about some of these things and just recognize that like, see, this is our place in the grand scheme of things. Our priority needs to be, you like Charlie, find the jobs for your people. Like you can be in a country where people get paid 800 cedis. Like that cannot be the pay, and then you're worried about the bigger like geopolitical. I mean, it's important. Like we need to engage with it because again, it affects us one way or the other. So that to the extent that we understand how it affects us is important. But then it doesn't. But then that extent is not. We don't. Exactly, it doesn't, man. You don't become the country that solves the world's problem. You become the country that recognizes that, like, Charlie, the cards that you've been dealt with are not great. So, Charlie, do the basics.
Yeah, well, let's see, because, like, I'm looking at, and this is just my last point, right? Like, I'm looking at the AFCTA now. And if Africa can, especially at this point where we really, really need it, especially when we are entering into the new age where, like you said, there's a scramble for new mineral resources by these two superpowers, and there's a lot of them. There's a lot of lithium, copper being discovered in Congo, Zambia, etc. Imagine that we've been able to consolidate free trade within Africa, and then we've been able to consolidate ourselves politically. That means that we have a clear bargaining chip at the table moving forward.
Bro, the solution is in-house, like honestly, and like that's the Pan-African view right now. Like I truly believe like the solution is in-house, and like you don't need to pitch yourself like to America or to the West or to China. Like you really need to and again, even in as much as like the solution is in-house, it's still like the recognition that like, I mean, Africa is not a monolith. Like everyone has their own interests. Like we've seen how Rwanda and the Congo and all of, and like South Africa coming in and Kenya and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah. But like I think we get to leverage more internally than pitching ourselves to the US or to whoever it is, right? And so, yes, our politics needs to be anti-imperialist, anti-neocolonialism and all of that kind of stuff, right? But we still also just need to recognize our place in the like larger scheme of things and just like answer like the basics, like, bro, feed yourself, make your country hospitable for people. Don't make it look like, okay, the only way out for your people is to like leave the country, right? Like it's not great. Like everyone wants to be in that country, like in an ideal world.
No. Like I mean, it's that last point. I feel like it's almost another conversation. I need to put that down because like the best brains, like over the last since COVID, like the best people that I know from my generation are no longer in their countries, and it's not. That's not the story that we want to be saying, right? No, I just want to open up, give you the opportunity for like final words if you want to wrap up.
I mean, definitely very great conversation, and I really like that. Like, it's like for the most part, it's just been geopolitics because like geopolitics is very important to us, and just knowing where we are like as a people, and the last thing you just said just reminded me of something very important to just like really chip in about how. We also need to recognize that like at the end of the day, interest is always like national interest is always going to override every single thing, right? And so like post-COVID, everyone, like we saw how countries like the UK were like, oh yeah, come to our country, like we need you, all that kind of stuff. And then all of a sudden now you're being reminded, now we don't need you. Like you people are like islands of strangers, and you need to get like double the amount of time that you previously were required to like become a citizen, all of that kind of stuff. And it's important, right? Like you see, like for a while, people really thought, like Charlie, I'm from Japan and just forget about my country. But like, one, you'll be reminded like you don't belong. Like that one, you'll be reminded. And also, like the ability to Boga is very much a function of like the privilege you have. Like you and I, we are privileged enough to have gone to like university, privileged enough to have like more outward looking, and so we could leverage on these things to like get out of the country. But there's so many of our colleagues that are also just as smart or even smarter than us, but like they couldn't get that opportunity, right? And then there are even like millions who have no means whatsoever of being able to do that. And so as like and so we are the privileged class, right? Like you and I and like people like us, we are like the privileged class. And so we owe it to ourselves to always like engage with these issues and inform contribute to how we inform conversations. In the last election, I'm not gonna lie, I was one of the people who underestimated the relevance of like social media. But I really got a rude awakening, it was a very shocking like turn of this. And like I in real time I saw how conversations on like platform like Twitter would lead to headlines on Facebook, which would then lead to videos and vlogs on TikTok. And like everyone is on TikTok. Because like TikTok allows you to just like speak in your language. And the videos are very easy to download and share. So like you can see how a viral tweet on X has led to headlines on Facebook, which goes to Ghana, we're one of those places. And then like vloggers are on that place on TikTok, and then people are sharing screenshots of that conversation on Twitter, on Instagram. So like the nodes, like the connection is incredible. So we truly shouldn't like underestimate our ability to like inform some of these conversations, right? Yeah, maybe we will not see it happening right now, but we've seen how like youth-led movements in Ghana have like shaped, in so many ways, it shaped the last election, right? shaped the last election, and it is currently like shaping conversations. You are seeing ministers, presidents, whoever it is, like coming on Twitter to explain their position on Facebook. Like it's you will come explain your body. Yeah. So I like that we are able to have these conversations, and I like that like we are platforming the people who have interest in these things. And I hate to sound like I'm sounding motivational, but like I beg, but I think it's important. That's me, I know, right?
yeah, that's me without the
flick,
this book. I think this has been a brilliant conversation. Like obviously,
there's a lot,
definitely
there's a lot to unpack
because there's still like so many things to explore.
There's a lot, man. There's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, and even here on the podcast, we are super passionate about some of these discussions. Like we do hope that this is what would kickstart like a lot of the awakening that.
Charlie, we can, that's our own. We are not sure we can talk. We don't have the political power yet. Thanks for having me, bro.
But thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I enjoyed the comments on Twitter when we finally released this. Thank you all so much for joining us in today's session. I had a conversation with Shafic Osman. We spoke about Trump and the tariffs and the rift with China and the implication this has for Africa. We went in depth into how some of these interactions and the history of the Bretton Woods institutions has influenced a lot of African nations, in this particular case, Ghana, and spoke about the modern political economy and spoke about the future of Africa. I hope you enjoyed this episode and stay tuned for the next ones. Please, just a quick reminder to please subscribe, comment, and share on these videos to give us the opportunity to continue making them, because we really, really love making them. We want to hear from you. Let us hear from you in terms of what next we need to discuss. But thank you all so much, and then we would see you. Bye.